In the depths of winter 1944, a group of German soldiers found themselves bound together, not by the familiar sights of battlefields, but by the heavy chains of captivity. The war, a seemingly endless struggle, had driven them from their homes, from the comfort of their families, to distant, hostile lands. The sound of war had long since faded into the harsh, unrelenting cold of their prison camps. But this was no ordinary winter. It was Christmas Eve. For the German prisoners of war, Christmas had always been a symbol of family, of warmth, of life before the chaos. Yet, in this new world, captured, confined, and cold, they could not have imagined that anything resembling their pre-war holiday could exist. The rations were meager, the conditions stark, and the guards were cold and indifferent. Hope was a distant memory. But on that particular Christmas Eve, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the usual cold silence, a strange invitation reached them. An invitation to join the families of their captors for Christmas dinner, too. Sit at a table surrounded by strangers who had once been their enemies was an unimaginable reality. The prisoners, guarded by suspicion, confusion, and fear, were uncertain. Could these enemies truly see them as more than just soldiers, more than pawns in a war they had all come to regret? Would they be treated with hostility, or would this unexpected gesture of kindness be the beginning of a new understanding in a world torn apart by violence? The Second World War had raged across Europe for nearly 5 years, and the conflict had reshaped not only the continent, but the very hearts of its people. Germany, under the brutal regime of Adolf Hitler, had set its sights on domination, and it was a war fought with an intensity and fervor that made it unlike any the world had seen before. The armies of the Third Reich marched across Poland, France, Russia, and beyond, with the goal of creating an empire built on conquest, violence, and ideological supremacy. But as the years wore on, the momentum of the war began to shift. In 1944, the tide was turning against Germany. The Allied forces, Britain, the United States, the Soviet Union, and others, had gained ground on every front, and German soldiers, once assured of victory, found themselves retreating. On the Western Front, the Allies had launched Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion, which marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's ambitions. For the German soldiers caught in the midst of this losing battle, life was a constant struggle. Fear of death, injury, or capture was a daily reality. They had been trained to see the enemy as less than human, to believe that their cause was just, and to fight for the glory of the fatherland. Yet, as the war dragged on, these beliefs were increasingly tested. The realities of war, famine, suffering, and loss began to erode the convictions of many soldiers. By 1944, many were simply trying to survive. But the war was not only fought on the front lines. Behind enemy lines, in the places where the battles were won or lost in the minds of soldiers, something remarkable was taking place. The very people who had been seen as the enemy were beginning to show a different side, one that would challenge everything the soldiers had been taught to believe. It was on the cusp of this transformation that the German prisoners of war, captured by the Allies in France and Belgium, were stunned by the events that unfolded on Christmas Eve, 1944. They had been expecting a grim holiday, captivity, harsh conditions, cold nights, and even colder hearts. But what they did not expect was an invitation to Christmas dinner. This act of compassion was not an isolated incident. Across occupied Europe, families, grieving their own losses, weary from years of war, decided to extend an olive branch to the very men who had once been their tormentors. But why? Why would families, who had lost their loved ones to the same German soldiers who now sat in their homes, open their doors and hearts to those they had once considered enemies? Was it a gesture of sheer goodwill, a Christian act of mercy, or something else? Could it be that, amid the devastation of war, humanity could still prevail? The history of this moment is not just a tale of surprise or hospitality. It is a reflection of the larger human condition during times of war. It is about the possibility of reconciliation, about seeing the enemy not as a symbol of hatred, but as a fellow human being, sharing the same suffering, the same fears, and the same hopes for a future free from conflict. But the story of these Christmas dinners is not just about the soldiers. It is also about the families who offered their homes to these prisoners. For them, too, the war had taken a heavy toll. Sons, fathers, and husbands had been lost, and their own homes were often in ruins. The invitation extended to the German POWs was as much an act of personal reflection as it was an act of mercy. It was a choice to believe in something better, to rise above the hatred that had been fostered by years of propaganda and violence. As we explore this remarkable chapter of history, we must ask ourselves, what does it mean to be human in a time of war? Can acts of kindness, no matter how small, truly change the course of conflict? And what ultimately is the power of compassion in the face of overwhelming hatred? In the coming sections, we will dive deeper into the lives of the German POWs, how they were captured, how they had been taught to view their captors, and how this holiday season would upend their expectations in ways they could never have imagined. It was late in the year when the first whispers of defeat began to reach the German soldiers stationed in France and Belgium. The events that led to their capture were the culmination of a series of desperate Allied offensives, which had gradually pushed the German forces back from their initial successes in Europe. Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings, and the subsequent battles had severely weakened the once proud German military machine. The soldiers who had fought in these campaigns, many of them young and inexperienced, now found themselves fighting not for victory, but for survival. The battlefields were no longer familiar. The days of proud, coordinated blitzkrieg attacks were far behind. German troops, exhausted and disillusioned, had been retreating steadily, and many were now encircled by the advancing Allied forces. It was during this chaotic time that these soldiers were taken prisoner, captured in pockets of resistance, at the tail end of failed offensives, or in ambushes laid by the very men they had fought to defeat. For the German soldiers, the moment of capture was filled with confusion, fear, and anger. They had been trained to view their captors, whether British, American, or French, as the enemy, as the ones who threatened their homeland and their way of life. The propaganda they had been fed since childhood told them that the Allies were not only their adversaries, but also inferior beings, motivated by greed, envy, and resentment. The war, they were led to believe, was a righteous struggle, one that would eventually prove the superiority of the German people. When they were captured, many of these soldiers still clung to these beliefs, seeing their imprisonment as a temporary inconvenience, a disruption in their inevitable victory. They expected nothing less than harsh treatment, even brutality, from their captors. Prison camps were notorious for their grueling conditions. The POWs anticipated overcrowded barracks, inadequate food, and the constant threat of violence. The guards, they were told, would be hostile and indifferent, offering no mercy to those who had fought against them. Most importantly, they expected to be treated as little more than spoils of war, stripped of their humanity, reduced to mere statistics in the grand, bloody ledger of the conflict. Yet, in the days following their capture, these soldiers began to realize that things were not as they had been led to believe. The camps, though not luxurious, were not the hellholes they had expected. The food, while not abundant, was better than they had anticipated. And most striking of all, there was a level of restraint in the behavior of their captors that they had not expected. The guards were firm, yes, but they were not cruel. The soldiers found themselves questioning the propaganda they had so long embraced. Was it possible that the enemy, the inferior ones they had been taught to despise, could be capable of decency? For some of the POWs, the first few days in captivity were filled with suspicion and confusion. They kept their distance, unsure of what to expect next. But as the days stretched into weeks, a sense of bewildering calm began to settle over them. The guards, though clearly dedicated to their duties, did not treat them with the animosity that had been promised. In fact, some of the prisoners began to see a glimmer of empathy in their captors' eyes, a humanity they had not anticipated. Then, just as the soldiers were beginning to adjust to their new, subdued reality, something entirely unexpected occurred. As Christmas approached, the POWs found themselves swept up in a wave of uncertainty and shock. The guards, who had treated them with distant professionalism up until that point, suddenly changed. In the midst of the cold, impersonal routine of captivity, something warm and profoundly human began to emerge. It started with a few simple gestures, food, blankets, a kind word here and there. But these were only the beginning, and then came the invitations. The families of the soldiers' captors, most of whom had endured their own share of grief and loss during the war, began reaching out to the prisoners. At first, the invitations seemed like a mistake, or perhaps a cruel joke. How could the very people they had fought against, people who had lost their own sons, brothers, and husbands, invite them to share in a Christmas meal? It was, after all, the holiday season, and in their minds, they expected to be left to the cold isolation of the camps, perhaps given a meager meal and a few hours of rest. But to sit at the table of their enemies? To break bread with them? To share in the warmth of their homes? This was beyond comprehension. As the German soldiers processed these invitations, their minds swirled with confusion. They had been trained to view the Allies as subhuman, as people who sought to destroy their country. Yet here were these families reaching out to them, offering a gesture of kindness that defied all reason. What was the motive behind it? Was it an attempt to humiliate them? Or was there something more to it? Something that, at this point in the war, they were not yet ready to understand. The invitation was, in itself, a moment of moral reckoning for these soldiers. The notion of mercy, the very idea that their captors could extend such kindness to them, was something that contradicted everything they had been taught. In that moment, the prisoners were faced with a choice. They could dismiss it as a mere propaganda tool, or they could step into the unknown and face whatever lay ahead with open eyes. For those who accepted the invitation, this would become a moment of profound change, an experience that would upend their view of the world, of their captors, and of the war they had fought. But for now, they waited, uncertain of what Christmas would bring. When the German prisoners first stepped across the threshold of their captors' homes, the sights, smells, and warmth of the interiors seemed otherworldly. For months, they had endured the cold, the dampness of the barracks, the harshness of camp life, where food was scarce and the morale was lower than ever. The homes they were entering stood in stark contrast to the sterile, grim environments of the POW camps. The smell of roasting meats, freshly baked bread, and warm, spiced wine filled the air. The flicker of candles illuminated simple but well-kept rooms, casting soft shadows on the wooden beams of the ceilings. The soldiers, accustomed to the chill of the barracks and the sparse, often tasteless meals, could hardly comprehend what they were witnessing. As they were ushered into cozy dining rooms, many of the prisoners felt an overwhelming sense of discomfort and alienation. These were the very people they had been taught to hate, to see as subversive or inferior, and yet here they were, offering them food, shelter, and, more shockingly, compassion. Some soldiers, at first, hesitated to sit, unsure of how to react. They had grown accustomed to suspicion, to being eyed with hostility. But now they were greeted not with contempt, but with something utterly unfamiliar: human decency. The families, many of whom had lost their own loved ones in the war, sons, fathers, and brothers, greeted the POWs with an air of tentative warmth. There were no overt gestures of hostility, no expressions of triumph. The guests were treated as guests, albeit reluctant ones, and in some cases, the hosts did not even speak of the war. Instead, they focused on the meal, the company, The simple rituals that had once defined Christmas. The carving of the roast, the passing of plates, the sharing of stories. For the prisoners, this was a deeply disorienting experience. Some of the German soldiers had expected the worst. Resentment, perhaps, or cold politeness. But the atmosphere was far from what they had anticipated. There were no shouts of vengeance or accusations of the atrocities they had committed. Instead, the families spoke in soft tones, as if sharing an unspoken understanding of the suffering that the war had caused on both sides. Some prisoners sat in silence, still processing the strange kindness being extended to them. Others tried to engage in conversation, their voices tentative, unsure of what to say. One German soldier later recalled his feelings in a letter home. The meal was not much, but the warmth, the conversation, this was something I never expected. The family, so torn by the same war that took me from my own home, offered me something I had never imagined. A small kindness, a smile, a drink of wine. I wondered if they thought I was human, or if this was just a gesture. Could such a thing be possible after everything we'd done to each other? Some soldiers were skeptical, even uneasy. What was the true motivation behind this act? Could these families possibly have forgotten the horrors inflicted upon their cities, their families, and their loved ones? Were they simply trying to extract information or humiliate them in some way? Or was this, as some came to believe, an act of pure Christian mercy, a gesture that transcended the bitterness of war? These questions lingered as the soldiers looked around the room at their hosts, trying to understand how they could have been so generous in the face of so much destruction. But despite their uncertainty, the soldiers could not ignore the warmth, both literal and metaphorical, that filled the rooms. The coldness of war had seeped into their bones, into their hearts. And now, for the first time in what felt like ages, they were being offered not just food, but a glimpse of humanity, of normal life, something they had almost forgotten existed. The harshness of battlefields, the endless grinding of conflict, seemed momentarily distant. Here, in these homes, there was only peace, however brief and fragile it may have seemed. And yet, even as the prisoners allowed themselves to take in the hospitality, there was an undeniable discomfort that lingered beneath the surface. The laughter of the children, the clink of glasses, the quiet conversation around the table. These simple joys were not just reminders of the families they had lost. They were also reminders of the lives they had taken. The German soldiers could not help but feel the weight of the war, of their role in the devastation that had torn Europe apart. As they shared this meal, their minds flickered between gratitude and guilt. Were they deserving of this kindness? For some, the shock came not just from the hospitality, but from the realization that these families, who had suffered immeasurably, were still capable of such generosity. They had every reason to hate, to despise the men who had invaded their homes, their cities, and destroyed their way of life. Yet, instead of bitterness, there was forgiveness, or at least the attempt at it. The German POWs were struck by the sheer humanity of the act. The families could have chosen to hold on to their anger, to condemn these prisoners as the enemy, to give them the coldest reception possible. But instead, they extended a hand. They treated them as people, not as symbols of hate or destruction. Some POWs began to realize that the image of the enemy they had been taught to see was not as clear-cut as they had once believed. These people, too, were caught in the web of war, suffering as they did, with no real choice but to endure. The reaction was not uniform. Some soldiers embraced the warmth and the food, and for the first time in years, allowed themselves to smile, to converse, to enjoy a simple human connection. Others remained distant, unable to fully let go of the prejudices they had carried with them into captivity. But the most profound shift occurred in those who did allow themselves to experience this unexpected hospitality. For them, Christmas dinner was not just about food or drink, it was a revelation. They were no longer enemies. They were simply people. As the evening drew to a close, with the warmth of the meal lingering in their bodies and the strains of a distant Christmas carol filling the air, the prisoners were left to ponder the complexities of war. Could mercy, after all the destruction, still be possible? Were these families really capable of forgiveness? Or was this simply a momentary lapse in judgment, an aberration in the cold logic of war? For the soldiers who chose to see it, Christmas dinner became a profound lesson, a lesson that would continue to unfold in the days and weeks that followed. The days that followed the Christmas dinner were a time of deep reflection for the German POWs. The warmth of the holiday meal had faded, replaced by the harshness of their captivity, but the experience had left an indelible mark on them. For many, the emotional weight of the invitation to dinner and the unexpected kindness of the families who had hosted them lingered far longer than the physical warmth of the food they had eaten. This moment of humanity, amid the chaos and carnage of the war, sparked a fundamental contradiction within their minds, one that would only grow stronger in the days that followed. The German soldiers had been conditioned, from an early age, to see the Allies as something other than human. They had been taught to dehumanize their enemies, to view them as subversive, morally inferior, even subhuman. This wasn't just a matter of military strategy or wartime propaganda. It was deeply embedded in their worldview, and when the soldiers were captured, they expected to encounter only hostility and resentment. After all, these were the very people whose homes they had invaded, whose cities they had bombed, and whose loved ones they had killed. But now, faced with this unexpected kindness, the soldiers began to question everything they had been taught. They had arrived at the POW camps with one set of beliefs, only to have those beliefs shattered by their experiences in the homes of their captors. In the warmth of those homes, surrounded by families who had lost so much to the war, the notion of the enemy began to feel hollow, almost absurd. How could people who had suffered so much extend such compassion to those who had contributed to their suffering? How could they, in the midst of their own grief, offer a moment of peace to those they had every reason to hate? The contradictions only deepened as the days passed. Life in the POW camp resumed its routine: drills, work assignments, the occasional letter home. Yet, the POWs were no longer the same. They could no longer see the Allied soldiers, the people who had captured them, as one-dimensional villains. They had spent years fighting for a cause that seemed just and noble to them, only to find themselves now at the mercy of those they had once despised. And yet, those same people, whom they had viewed as inferior, as the other, had shown them a level of empathy that was both bewildering and humbling. One German soldier, a young man named Karl, wrote in a letter to his family, "The war is different now. The men who guard us, the women who invited us to dinner, they are not monsters. They are people, just like us. I cannot understand it. They have lost everything, and yet they show us kindness. It makes me wonder, what was it all for? What was the point of this war if it has led us here, to this place, this moment of grace?" Karl's words echoed the confusion many of the prisoners felt. They had been taught to view the war as a righteous crusade, a mission to protect their homeland and their people from what they were told were the dangers posed by the Allies. But now, as they looked into the eyes of the families who had taken them in, they were confronted with a different truth, one that forced them to confront the moral implications of their actions. The families who had lost loved ones in the war, who had witnessed the destruction of their homes, were capable of offering forgiveness, of reaching across the divide of hatred to offer a simple gesture of humanity. How could this be? The POWs had been prepared for battle, for survival, but they had not been prepared for this. They had not been prepared for the crushing realization that they were fighting for a cause that had left devastation in its wake, not just for the countries they had invaded, but for their own hearts and minds. What had they really been fighting for? Could they reconcile the teachings of their leaders with the reality they were now living in? It was not just the POWs who were affected by this paradox. The families who had invited the prisoners into their homes also grappled with their own contradictions. Many of these families had lost sons, husbands, and brothers in the war. Their homes had been bombed, their cities reduced to rubble. The war had taken everything from them. And yet, in the midst of this, they chose to extend kindness to the very men who had caused their suffering. It was a decision fraught with emotional turmoil. Could they forgive those who had destroyed so much of their world? Could they look beyond the uniforms, beyond the propaganda, and see the individual soldier as a human being, as someone capable of redemption? Some of the families struggled with these questions. They had seen their own homes ravaged by the German military machine. They had seen their sons and daughters die in the name of a cause that had never been their own. And now, here they were, offering a seat at the table to the very men who had taken so much from them. It was a moral dilemma that could not be easily resolved. One French woman, whose husband had been killed in an air raid, recalled the moment when she invited a German soldier into her home. I knew he was one of them. I knew he had likely been part of the forces that had bombed our city. But when I looked at him sitting there, I saw a young man, a man who had suffered too. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't turn him away. The war had taken so much from us. Couldn't I offer him this small gesture? Couldn't we too rise above it? The contradictions were everywhere. They played out in the actions of the soldiers, who were slowly realizing that the lines between us and them were not as clearly drawn as they had once believed. And they played out in the families who had been touched by war, whose wounds were still fresh, but whose hearts were willing to forgive. As the days wore on, the sense of internal conflict grew stronger. Some of the German soldiers began to question their loyalty to the Nazi regime, while others struggled to reconcile their training with the new realities they were encountering. The internal battles raged on as each prisoner came to terms with the profound contradiction at the heart of their captivity. They were the enemy, and yet they were also human beings. And in the quiet of the holiday season, this truth began to become undeniable. As the weeks passed after the Christmas dinners, the German prisoners of war found themselves increasingly at odds with the narrative they had lived by for so long. The war had been their identity, their purpose. It had defined them, given them a cause to fight for, and a sense of duty to protect. But now, in the cold reality of captivity, surrounded by the families they had once been taught to hate, the soldiers could no longer ignore the contradictions that had taken root in their minds. The war had lost its certainty, its clarity. In its place, there was confusion, discomfort, and the dawning realization that the conflict they had fought in had been not just about territorial conquest or ideological supremacy, but about the very human cost of destruction. The pivotal moment in this transformation came a few weeks after Christmas, when the German soldiers, having had time to reflect on the hospitality they had received, were confronted with a simple but profound question. Could they continue to live with the knowledge of what they had done? Could they reconcile their participation in the war with the kindness that had been extended to them, even in their position as prisoners of war? One afternoon, as the soldiers were gathered in the camp, a few of them had an impromptu conversation. Tentative at first, as if speaking aloud the thoughts they had kept to themselves for months. They spoke of the dinners, the kindness of the families, the warmth of the homes they had entered. They spoke of the faces of the children who had looked at them with innocent curiosity, and of the women who had served them dinner, their eyes filled with both sorrow and hope. One of the prisoners, a man named Hans, finally asked the question that had been lingering in the air for weeks. What have we been fighting for? Hans had been a loyal soldier, committed to the Nazi cause until this point. But as he sat in the camp, surrounded by other prisoners who had been caught up in the same war, he could no longer deny the painful truth that had become evident in the most unexpected of places: the warmth of a holiday dinner table. The realization was a quiet one, a slow unraveling of everything they had been taught to believe. They were not just pawns in a war, They were individuals capable of choice, capable of change. This conversation, although brief, was the beginning of a shift in the mindset of many of the German soldiers. The walls that had once divided them from the Allies, that had once made it possible to justify the atrocities they had participated in, began to crumble. In the harshest of circumstances, in the most unexpected of settings, they had come to see their captors as human beings, people who had suffered as much as they had, if not more. And in this realization, the soldiers began to recognize that the war had been a great lie, a lie that had been fed to them for years. The pivotal moment came just days later, when the POWs were told that they would be transported to another camp, far from the homes they had visited. The decision to move the prisoners was not unexpected. The war was far from over, and the Allies were still uncertain about what to do with the prisoners once the fighting ceased. But for the German soldiers, the prospect of leaving the camp, of leaving behind the faces of the families who had shown them kindness, filled them with a sense of loss. They had grown accustomed to the life they had found in the camp. Strangely, it had begun to feel more like home than the war-torn land they had left behind. One of the prisoners, a man named Otto, reflected on the transformation he had undergone. When we came here, we were enemies. We looked at each other with suspicion, with hatred. But now, after everything, the meals, the conversations, the small kindnesses, I see them differently. They are not the enemy. They are people, like us. I don't know what will happen after the war, but I know this. I will never forget what they did for us. I will never forget what we could have been, had we not been blinded by the war. The prisoners, in their final days at the camp, began to question the very concept of the war they had fought. It was no longer a battle between nations, between ideologies. It was a battle for survival, a struggle to reclaim something lost, not just land or power, but humanity. They began to see the enemy not as something to be crushed, but as something they could understand, and even respect. This was the transformation that would linger in their minds long after the war ended. It was a transformation that allowed them to see past the uniform they wore, to see each other as human beings first, and soldiers second. The climax of this internal struggle came not in a dramatic battle, but in a quiet realization. There would be no great speech or fiery exchange. It was, instead, a simple understanding that occurred as they prepared to leave the camp. The war had not been just a fight between nations, but a battle that had been fought within their own hearts and minds. And the true victory, they realized, was not one of military might, but one of compassion, understanding, and forgiveness. As the soldiers boarded the transport that would take them to another camp, they left behind not just the familiar faces of their captors, but the remnants of their old beliefs. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, they felt a sense of clarity. They no longer needed to see the enemy as other. They had learned, through the most unexpected of experiences, that true victory lay not in defeating the enemy, but in overcoming the hatred that had been planted in their hearts long ago. The war eventually came to an end, and the German prisoners were repatriated to their homeland. Some returned to families who had also been scarred by the ravages of conflict, others to a country that had been devastated by its own aggression. The world had changed irreparably, and so had they. They were no longer the soldiers who had marched off to war with unwavering certainty in their cause. The years spent in captivity, particularly the unexpected kindness shown to them by their captors, had transformed their understanding of the world and of themselves. Many of these former prisoners carried with them a powerful lesson, that the real enemy was not the people they had fought against, but the hatred and fear that had been cultivated in their hearts. They had been taught to dehumanize the Allies, but the truth of war had shattered that perception. The kindness extended by those they had once seen as enemies had demonstrated that despite the violence and suffering, humanity could still prevail. In offering a meal, a warm place to rest, and a glimpse of mercy, These families had shown the prisoners what was possible beyond the conflict. For those soldiers, the memory of the Christmas dinners would never fade. It was a moment of transformation, a recognition that in the darkest times, kindness could defy the odds, breaking through the walls of hatred and animosity that had once seemed insurmountable. The story of the German POWs and the families who invited them to Christmas dinners serves as a timeless reminder that even in the most divided and brutal of times, compassion can be a force for profound change. It challenges us to consider, in a world still torn by conflict, can we still find the courage to extend that same mercy